Well, there's been this discussion lately about if Georgia can really have any competition inside the SEC, which always leads to Alabama. And Paul Finebaum had a very long statement. Ryan talked about it on Sunday, but this is the part I want to touch on with from Paul Finebaum. He says what's so interesting about Georgia is that Kirby Smart was a big part of the last major assault on the last three-peat. He was the defensive coordinator 10 years at Alabama. 10 years ago at Alabama, that was derailed by the famous kick six play. That was one of the most epic plays in college football history. Alabama didn't win that year the national championship or the SEC. Kirby Smart, now the head coach at Georgia, has a chance to do what he couldn't do as an assistant for Nick Saban. I think a lot of people very clearly remember that Kirby was the defensive coordinator at Alabama in 2013, and that if you think back to that run of Alabama football in 2013. They lost to Ole Miss at the beginning of the season. I think it was. I can't. No, I stand corrected. That was a year later. The problem that season for Alabama, of course, was that Georgia had Auburn on the ropes, had them beat in fourth and whatever. Prayer at Jordan Hare. That win alone by Auburn kept them in the SEC championship race, which at the end of the day knocked Alabama out after they had the miracle play on the Plains. So I quite clearly remember, that was an Alabama team that really didn't have a lot of competitive games until the Auburn game. And they beat Virginia Tech by 25. They beat Texas A&M on the road by 7. That was certainly a competitive game. But they were running away from A&M a lot of that game. They beat Colorado State lopsided, beat Ole Miss by 25, Georgia State by 42, Kentucky by 41, Arkansas 52-35 against Tennessee, 21 against LSU, 13 against Mississippi State, and then they hammered Chattanooga the week before they lost to Auburn. And that team, I don't know if that team beats Florida State or not, but I'm pretty sure they do. And that's sort of what Georgia is going into here is this is not a program that has eaten a lot of losses lately. And it could be that they lose the wrong game this season. And that's what happened to Alabama in 2023. They just lost the wrong game. And a year later in 2024... in 2014, they lost in that Ohio State game when they looked, I don't think they looked indestructible. They had lost, like I said earlier, at the beginning part of the season to Ole Miss. Just a sort of shocking result that came out of nowhere. They had to save themselves against Arkansas. They needed overtime against LSU. But they came into the college football playoff as the number one seed, and Ohio State just zoomed right past them 42-35 in the Sugar Bowl. It was a bizarre thing to witness. This was an Alabama team that beat number one Mississippi State, that beat top 15 Auburn, that beat the brakes off of Missouri. They were pretty hot at the end of the season. They struggled more than they did at other times, but they were pretty hot. But I totally remember what it was like. It definitely looked like. It appeared that Georgia Tech... Actually, I'm going to get to a Georgia Tech story in a second here. It appeared like Alabama was going to go 3 for 3. It would have been an amazing accomplishment with just like 2 losses in there. Hey, make sure you're picking up double dogs. When you do, you get our 2023 preview included with it. Our friends at Red Zone are helping us out with this. If you've not seen the book, that's cool. Not a problem. I know we have thousands of new visitors each day on here. So it's a look at the 2022 season that you're not going to see anywhere else. Images and so forth. You're definitely not going to see a 2023 preview about Georgia. That's nothing but Georgia. If you want Lindy's or all those are good publications. They're not about Georgia, though. They're about Southern Miss and LSU. So be forewarned. I think for Georgia, when you look at the 23 season, there's no game that just sits out there like, oh man, they better watch Saturday, they're going to lose. Tennessee on the road is as close as you get to that. I would say something like that would be, in that ballpark. They got to go to Auburn. South Carolina comes to Athens. I think those are all games that For Georgia, they can lose those games. I don't think they will, but they can. But if what Kirby's saying is true about how we're not planning to beat anybody, we're planning to beat everybody, then that means it's a 15-game season. That means that you're probably going to have to keep it clean all the way to Atlanta, or you're going to have to win in Atlanta. Georgia's not exactly been overwhelmingly successful in the SEC championship. They've been successful, but not overwhelmingly. They lost in 18, 19, and 21. They're 2-3 in Atlanta. In the championship game under Kirby. So that's not great. I don't know I think Nick's lost once in the championship game against Florida in 2009. Has he lost an SEC championship game since? Probably deserved to lose in 2018, but he didn't. And, so when Alabama gets to Atlanta, they typically win. Georgia can't say that. So I think that's why the regular season is so important for Georgia as it stands right now. But, I remember quite clearly, I don't know. I mean, I love Paul Finebaum. I think he's a very good historian. I think there's a lot of foolishness on the show that I don't put up with necessarily. But I wonder if he's talking to a crowd here that's that young. I mean, do people really not know that Kirby was there in 2013? I think his audience is a lot broader, obviously, than mine is. But here's the quote again. What's so interesting about Georgia is that Kirby Smart was a big part of the last major assault on the three-peat. He was the defensive coordinator 10 years ago when Alabama was derailed on the famous kick six play. I think what's forgotten there is that had Georgia not had that loss to Auburn, then the kick six wouldn't have really mattered in the grand scheme of things. Alabama would have gone on to play Florida State in the national championship game had they lost to Auburn or not. That's just what it was. And, I remember being in the locker room. It's not a locker room. I remember being in the weight room at Georgia Tech, which is where the post-game press conference is for whatever reason. I'm not hating. I'm just telling you where it is at Georgia Tech. And it looked like Alabama was going to win that game. It looked like they were kind of, they had been in a fight with Auburn and they were going to win. But I could not believe it when I heard that they lost that game. I mean, Alabama had not lost at that point in some time. It had been, I think, since the Texas A&M game in 2012. Well, yeah. I mean, they had just slaughtered Notre Dame. I mean, they're only really, in 13, in 13. They just did not have a lot of competitive games. The A&M game, yes. But until Auburn, they did not have a game that was within 2 scores at the end of the game. In 2012, obviously they survived Georgia. That was a nightmarish game for them. They lost to Texas A&M. They had a tight win against LSU. But, I mean, generally speaking, other than that, Alabama had their way with everybody. But, man, the way they thumped their way to the national championship, 42-14 in 2012, it didn't seem like 12 games later that anything new was going to happen. But they just lost the wrong game. And we've not seen that from Georgia lately. Well, they've lost the wrong game. I mean, they lost the wrong game in 2020 against Florida. They lost the wrong game, which was really the LSU game in 19 and 18. They lost to Alabama. And they lost to Alabama in the national championship game. But what I mean by saying they lost the wrong game is typically games that prevent you from championship opportunities. Georgia's not lost a lot of those. I mean, in 20, definitely when they lost to Florida. 19, when they lost to South Carolina, I mean, we can't really say that. 18, they lost to LSU. And in 17, they lost to Auburn on the road. I mean, those were not games that really prevented them from winning the national championship or the SEC championship. So, Alabama just lost the wrong game at Auburn. That was the same night that Todd Gurley just went off on Georgia Tech. And that was a precursor of what was coming with Hudson Mason as quarterback. Georgia just really had a hard time moving the ball in a way that was effective, frankly. And in overtime, When Georgia got down 20-3 or whatever the score was, was it 20-0? I mean, I was like, man, they're gonna lose this game. Like, they're not coming back from this. And of course they did win that game somehow. But I mean, it was thanks to Todd Gurley. They got down 20-0. I mean, they were getting drilled, and cut it down to I don't know. They got within 3 going to the fourth quarter. But then Tech had a touchdown that pushed the score out to 10, and then Georgia, as I remember, it was tight. They had to have a late field goal just to stay into overtime. And then, Tech with a touchdown, Georgia with a touchdown, and then Georgia with a tie. So Todd, I think, as I recall, there was one play that did not feature Todd Gurley. All of the rest of the plays were Todd Gurley runs, and many of them touchdowns. So Georgia had a 3-play. So they have 4 plays in overtime. All of those, but I think the first play in the first overtime were Todd Gurley touches. So he touched the ball 3 times. Twice were touchdowns in that game. That was the same night that Alabama's three-peat died at Auburn. I mean, just a bitter loss for them. Will that happen to Georgia? Could it be Georgia Tech that does that to them? We'll have to see.